once you understand where the non-science is coming from, where the propaganda is coming from, and it is industry, pharmaceutical, and religious ideology. Now I understand why I was conned in my medical education. Now I understand why the food pyramid is wrong. It's not that I'm trying to be controversial, it's just that virtually everything in this field is like a house of cards. You poke the house of cards, it just falls down on the first question. Every time your blood glucose goes up, you are effectively toasting a little bit of your brain, a little bit of your eyes, a little bit of your kidneys, a little bit of your blood vessels, a little bit of your skin. And so we end up seeing all of those byproducts building up over time. Because if you eat by the food pyramid, you're going to die by the food pyramid. And along the way, you're going to look like the food pyramid, that triangular shape. I've said to patients, look, I get it. It takes time. You've got a choice, however, of spending that time cooking the food now and preparing it and spending quality time as a family, or spending that time in my waiting room.
Gary, according to the way you look at our modern disease crisis, at the heart of this is inflammation. So let's talk about why and the biggest factors that contribute to that.
Well, why is we're simply out of control with our, I don't call it a health system anymore, it's a sickness industry. And we can keep band-aiding sick care, that's one of my wife's terms. We can keep throwing money at the system. You're based in Canada, we're based in Australia here. Both systems are under crisis. The US spends more per person per capita on health than any other country in the world. It's got one of the poorest health outcomes. We throw money at our indigenous population with just lousy outcomes. So whatever we're doing, spending more money and trying to treat things doesn't work. So, I mean, the fundamental situation is go back to the root cause. And if you go back to the root cause of modern disease, which has progressively developed since our agricultural revolution, the root cause of disease is actually comes back to inflammation. And that sits underneath absolutely everything. It's not just what people think of inflamed, red, hot, angry tissues. It comes back to arthritis. It comes back to cancer. It comes back to diabetes. It comes back to mental health. So inflammation sits under absolutely every single condition. So if we can actually manage the root cause of inflammation, then we're on that journey, and that's really my journey. And I've been an orthopaedic surgeon for 30 odd years. The problem is we keep just operating on people who have got long-term inflamed joints. We can give them medications, whether or not they're simple painkillers, or we can give them anti-inflammatories, and they can be steroidal like cortisone, prednisolone, or we can give them non-steroidals, and a whole variety of those. So again, that's just treating the inflammation. So my last 12, 13 years has actually been going back and looking at the cause of that. And that's been a fascinating journey. So rightly or wrongly, about 12 years ago, I came up with a model of inflammation based on our nutrition. And I'm very proud of that. And I can still remember a 4-country, 5-person email over an Easter weekend where I'm going, hang on, I think I've got this jigsaw puzzle. And it's literally the combination of what's our diet. And so it's the combination, in my mind, of fructose, which is half of sugar, refined carbohydrates, and polyunsaturated seed oils. And together, and we can talk about some of that biochemistry going forward, but effectively that's a perfect storm for creating inflammation in every cell membrane, in every blood vessel wall, in every corner of the body. So if we look at that combination, it is literally, it's like the old fairy tale of the 3 pigs. If you build your house out of kindling, then it's just ready to go. And so we've effectively got our bodies, our embryos, the fetus, the child, the young adult, right through to old age, is now built of kindling. Our cells, the whole lot is just set, ready to go, and chronically inflamed. And that's it. That's really it. I think we pay more attention to what fuel we put in our cars than what we do in our bodies. And so if we actually just come back to the root cause, I've described this model of inflammation. Pretty simple. There it is. It's a hypothesis. It can never be tested in real terms. But as a result of that hypothesis, if you do the opposite, which is you reduce the amount of sugar in your diet, you certainly reduce the amount of refined carbohydrates, and you get rid of the vegetable oils, the seed oils, those industrial toxic mechanism, then you reduce inflammation and people get better. And okay, we can finish the interview now. We're done.
If you're enjoying the episode, take a second and let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the episode. Well, let's take some time and dig into each of the big three here, starting with fructose. And the obvious first question there is we have our natural fructose in things like fruit, and then we have our high fructose corn syrup. So when we say fructose, are we talking about all fructose or keeping it under a certain limit, sticking with the natural forms? How do you look at that?
Well, it's all fructose. Fructose is fructose. So it's very similar to glucose. It's got the same number of atoms in it. They're just structured slightly differently. And we know a lot about glucose metabolism because it's been studied for hundreds of years or 100 years. But our understanding of the metabolism of fructose only actually came definitively described by Luc Tappy, who's a Swiss guy, in 2011. So it's brand new, the information around it. We've sort of had some understanding over the last 30 or 40 years, but my textbooks, which are, 40 years old, 35, 40 years old, actually barely scratch the surface of fructose metabolism. And even the current textbooks, which are taught to medical students, barely touch upon it. So fructose is completely and utterly metabolized differently to glucose. And so the sugar molecule is half glucose, half fructose. Whether or not you get that fructose from high fructose corn syrup, or you get it from honey, or you get it from fruit, it's all exactly the same molecule. So, and again, I'll put it in summary, and then I'll break it down back into the natural and the formulated one. So that fructose, in summary, is a small amount's converted to glycogen, which goes to restores muscle. The vast majority of it is metabolized in the liver on first pass. So the body doesn't like it getting from the gut into the bloodstream. It goes from the gut straight to the liver, metabolized very, very quickly. A small amount's metabolized in the mesentery of the gut, small amount in the testes. And there's some new work coming out suggesting it may be metabolized slightly differently in a few other structures, but effectively most of it goes straight to the liver, metabolized there. Small amount goes down an aldehyde pathway, which gets converted, which is effectively an alcohol pathway. I've got some diagrams of this in my talks. So, okay, you eat fructose, a small amount's going to get turned into, as a glass of red wine, but that is an alcohol pathway. Too much, and that's how we make alcohol. You ferment fruit, and it's the fermentation of the fructose gets converted to alcohol. Whether or not you have that in a glass of red wine or you have it in your liver doesn't really matter. It's the same pathway. Another portion goes towards uric acid production. There's an enormous amount of work about uric acid. Uric acid is a byproduct of fructose metabolism. It's the thing commonly heard of with gout, but it's a huge cornerstone in the inflammation pathway. And some of your viewers will understand about nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is, and I'm jumping between stuff, but nonetheless, it's all in diagram form in some of my other talks. Nitric oxide opens up your blood vessels to control our blood pressure. It controls the blood flow to our brain, and it controls our immunity. Uric acid inhibits nitric oxide function. So if you have too much fructose, you'll produce uric acid. Uric acid will, in fact, affect our blood pressure, affect our brain blood flow, and affects our immune system. So a lot of people nowadays have hypertension, high blood pressure. Literally, by dropping their sugar intake, they reduce their blood pressure within days. Literally. So that's the practical side of it. The practical side, cut out your sugar, your blood pressure will come down literally within days, and you'll need to come off medications or at least think about reducing them. That mechanism is via uric acid. Another pathway that fructose travels down is then into the production of fat, because the excess is converted to fat, which happens in nature. If you eat fruit as an animal and you gorge upon it, you're doing it to get fat for winter, hibernation. Again, that's it. It's a simple mechanism. In nature, fruit drives behavior, and it will go down that pathway of fat production. Some of that fat production actually then goes down in the end pathway to small, dense LDL particles. LDLs are a lipoprotein, how we transport fat and protein in the bloodstream. The current understanding is that the small, dense LDL particles, this is not the topic of cholesterol, the small, dense LDLs, when they become oxidized, and in which then are the ones which are a major association and likely cause of inflammation. So if you can actually cut down your fructose, then you cut down your small, dense LDL production, then they're not there to be oxidized, and as a result of that, you reduce your inflammation. Then there's another pathway which is actually related to our hunger. So fructose will go and inhibit leptin. And again, I'm using some terms here. Leptin's a hormone produced by the fat in our bodies. So if you've got plenty of leptin on, plenty of fat on board, the body produces leptin, and it says don't eat. Fructose breaks that pathway. So it actually that's at a hypothalamic level inside the brain, and actually, so therefore fructose will make you hungry. It will also stimulate a hormone called ghrelin, which is secreted by the stomach, which is the one which actually gives you that rumbling stomach. When you're hungry, you'll get, I've got a rumbly stomach. It's triggered all through the vagus nerve. And as a result of that, you then feel hungry. So fructose, wherever it comes from, will drive certain behaviors. Number one, it will make you hungry. Number two, it'll make you lethargic because of its alcohol effect. 3, it will make you agitated by the uric acid because your blood pressure will go up. You get a bit excited in that situation. And third, and then finally, it'll actually have this whole effect via the fat metabolism and fat storage. Richard Johnson is a nephrologist who studied this significantly, the role of uric acid in hibernation. And he'll actually look at, as an animal in hibernation, and I'm summarising a lot of Richard's work here in a short bit, so apologies, Richard, if you ever hear this. But if in hibernation, as you get towards the end of hibernation, you've burnt out in your fat stores, the body starts breaking down protein. One of those side effects is uric acid. Uric acid goes up, and then actually it starts agitating, and then you wake up out of hibernation to then start the cycle again. So coming full circle back to your original question, is there a difference? No. So fructose in fruit, which is the natural source of fructose is fruit and honey. Fruit in nature will drive behaviour, and you can see that in the animal kingdom. Here in Australia, we've got possums, which will literally come and strip a fruit tree bare 2 days before you actually want to eat it. They can't possibly eat that amount of fruit, but they do. They literally gorge themselves on it because they're getting fat. But it's the fructose and the uric acid which is actually driving that pathway to actually continue on. And so animals in the wild will just eat fruit until they can't eat anymore, or they strip the tree bare. But it's a survival mechanism. Now, we as humans go down through the same pathway. So it's a very addictive pathway. It's actually, it's talked about that it stimulates dopamine in the addiction center of the brain, a place called the nucleus accumbens. And again, it's just fascinating to watch. And we know our food drives behavior. I use the example, I don't know if, do your shops, your supermarkets close on Christmas Day? and Easter
On
Sunday.
Christmas, yes.
And you watch the frenzy of shopping in the 2 days before that, because people aren't going to get their food for 24 hours. It's completely irrational. But what I'm sort of saying is our food becomes a very irrational behavior. But a significant part of that is actually fructose. And so what happens, like sugar's 50% fructose, 50% glucose. Fruit, depending on the different forms, will have varying amounts of fructose and glucose, but it's roughly 50-50. Honey is about 55 to 45% glucose. That's why honey's sweeter than fruit. And high fructose corn syrup is in that same vicinity of 55-45. So again, I'll come back. If you want to eat fructose and you're an animal, and we're all animals, so we've got the same metabolism, if you want to eat it, that's fine. However, you should understand that it's going to drive behavior and it's going to have side effects. And if you want to eat fructose, understand you should be having it seasonally. When it's fresh. We can come back to what my philosophy is of eating, but if you're eating it, should be having fresh and local, and it should be seasonal. But understand it will make you hungry. So in season, I will have some berries, but I'll have them at night so that the hunger that it actually triggers for me, and when I'm saying some, I'll have 3 or 4. I'm completely addicted. But okay, I like that sweetness, but I'll have it later, in the evening, so that I sleep off the hunger. But if I have that for breakfast, then I'm going to be hungry through the course of the day. And you watch people with a bowl of grapes in front of them, or a bowl of cherries. They can't eat one. You ever seen that? People can't. You can't. If I give you a bowl of fruit, it's really hard just to have one. So I think fructose it has major behavioural actions. Here's a sideline: high fructose corn syrup. Who developed that? Do you know that one?
No, I don't.
The Japanese. So the Japanese actually sold that technology to the US. The high fructose corn syrup industry took off, largely related to corn subsidies and farming issues and financial ties. But that technology was actually sent to the US. And in a really cynical sort of way, who's actually won the war now? Like we've got a whole society in the US and large places around the world that are addicted to sugar and fructose, and that high fructose corn syrup might have actually been the weapon. Yeah. The weaponization of food. We talk about weaponization of everything, but there's a side thing.
What year was that?
That was 1950s, I think.
Okay.
That technology was around in the 1950s, and certainly then adopted by the 1960s.
And I would assume, too, it would depend on the person's goals and how metabolically healthy they are, how much they might want to introduce fruit to the diet. You mentioned having it seasonally, and you have a few berries at night periodically if they're in season. For somebody that is on the continuum of being insulin resistant or diabetic, I would say they want to stay away at that time, get metabolically healthy before they start introducing fruit if their goal is to get metabolically healthy again.
We sort of will continue to segue, I suppose. There's a talk I did through COVID because I was bored, and that talk's called Carbohydrate, the Dose is the Poison. So we've created this scenario now where people are carbohydrate aware. And I know we're winning because here in Australia there's half a dozen different low carb beers. So Australia's a beer drinking country, and the fact that we've got low carb beers means I win. There's the market's driven behavior or driven awareness. So I thought, okay, we've said carbs are troublesome. So the long and short of it is there is no single human biochemical pathway that requires carbohydrate. So we actually require zero carbohydrate in our diet to survive. We need to have essential fats in our diet. We need to have essential proteins. We need to have essential vitamins and minerals. But there's not a single pathway that we require to eat glucose or fructose, or combinations thereof, which becomes all the galactoses and the maltoses and dextroses. But effectively, we don't actually need it. So if there's actually no pathway that we require to survive, then it becomes a luxury item. And it is a luxury item. So fruit in nature is a luxury item. If you're an animal, you come across it seasonally and you will gorge upon that luxury item so you can get fat for winter. And in society, fruit is a luxury item. Coming back to Japan, I don't know if you've ever been there. They cherish fruit. So an apple, it will be served in an entire box, and it will be extremely expensive. But it is seen as a precious special item. It's not a mass-produced, chemically managed, hybridized fruit that we have now. So the fruit of history was small, tiny, wasn't nearly as sweet as it is now. And one of the reasons is we've hybridized fruit. It's been genetically modified, whether or not it's just not maybe genetically modified in the laboratory, even though certain strains are, but it is in fact now lower in fiber and higher in sugar. And it is like that because it actually drives market share, and it improves shelf life, and it improves profitability. The more sugar you have in the food, the longer it will last. Do you? I have an example in my office. I've always had a piece of bread, that's been toasted, and that piece of bread, I think, stayed there for 10 years. Didn't go mouldy. But so, by way of example, you get a whole grain bread, it will start going mouldy within a few days. You get, and that's because of the amount of fiber. And if you get a white bread, then it will take longer to go mouldy. If you get a piece of, do you have raisin bread or fruit bread?
We do.
Yeah, so that will stay ages before it goes mouldy. And then you take the extreme example, which is the wedding cake, which is the fruit mince wedding cake, which is very, very high in sugar. You can keep that piece of wedding cake and still eat it for your 10-year wedding anniversary, because all that's done is you've increased the amount of sugar in it. So sugar is a food preservative which keeps its shelf life. So again, fruit now is pretty well manufactured to have low fiber and more sugar in it for its addictive behaviour, and it's actually profitability. But effectively, we don't really need it. There's again another talk of mine on YouTube called "Is Fruit Good or Bad for You?" And the story with that one is I was asked to go in a debate against a professor of nutrition who actually advises the Defence Forces here in Australia, and I somehow or other I fell into it, and then so that talk stems from that. And about halfway through my talk, he just conceded defeat. He said, "Okay, I get it. Fruit's not good for us." And so, but the argument here is fruit is nowhere near as good for us as it's advertised in the marketplace and in nature. Fruit in nature is. Have you ever worked out why fruit wants us to eat it?
Yeah, the fact that the seeds.
Yeah, that's
we take it in and spread the seeds.
Yeah, so it's a two-way street. We want fruit, so we get fat for winter. Fruit wants us to eat it, so we can propagate its seed. It hasn't worked out that we actually just propagate the seed into a ceramic porcelain bowl now, and it's not very effective. But but how does fruit market itself to us?
Color, smell, taste.
Yeah. And it's bright and shiny. Like it's like a Christmas bauble. It's there to attract your attention, so we eat and do its work. But the so and it markets, and then the system, the marketplace now advertises it being rich in potassium and rich in in micronutrients and phytonutrients and everything underneath the sun. However, you get all of those in greater abundance from vegetables, which I'm having less of now. We can drift down that pathway later. But you get that from animal-based product. An animal-based product is going to be rich in the essential vitamins, the essential micronutrients, the essential mineral proteins, and the essential fats. And the animal-based product is very low in carbohydrate. And that's the way we evolved. We are here because we are we have a carnivore basis, and we are omnivores, I think, for survival. It's like our primary requirements are animal-based, but we will graze upon plant-based foods when we can't get our animal-based ones. So, we survive with a plant-based diet and we thrive on an animal-based diet. And that's, people think that's a controversial statement. No, it's frigging biochemistry. And that's all my arguments tend to be. This is biochemistry. I'm not making that stuff up. And the Krebs cycle, which is a basic part of physiology, whether or not you're an animal or a human or an insect, is how we turn our food into energy, adenosine triphosphate, ATP. And we get it, and it can be done via protein, fats, and carbohydrates. And God's whichever, God with a little g or a big G or whatever you believe in, God wasn't stupid enough to make us chemically dependent on a seasonal food source. God's given us the ability to actually utilize whatever is available in nature to give us energy to get from A to B. And that's called the Krebs cycle. The luxury item in that, the seasonally available ones, sugar and carbohydrate. But it comes at a price that it creates inflammation. The other thing about the seasonality and fructose, and again, it's in those talks with diagrams so people can understand it, is that fructose, the byproduct is that small, dense LDL particle, which gets into the blood vessel wall. That is cleared by macrophages called foam cells to get them out of the wall, and they're under the direct influence of vitamin D. So guess when fruit's actually seasonally available? It's normally the end of summer, beginning of autumn. And so if you want to eat it at that point in time, there's generally an abundant amount of sunlight around. So you're going to have good amounts of vitamin D to actually get rid of the inflammation. We are not meant to be eating fructose in the middle of winter when we don't have sun. So our vitamin D levels drop down. So I think we get more inflamed through winter by eating sugar. And I don't know if that's a contributing cause to that, the winter blues. You've got them in Canada, similar latitude north as we are south. At the end of winter, everyone's got the blues. And is it because their vitamin D levels are down, or is it because their vitamin D levels are down and their inflammation levels are higher? I don't know. Again, these are just theories I bounce around.
That's fascinating. And given we're starting to get a feel now for the way you eat and the way you advocate for, we've talked about fructose, fruit, vegetables. It sounds like at least some of those are on the menu, and you're a big fan of animal protein. Is there anything, given all you've said about the fact you lean heavily towards the animal proteins, is there anything we can't get from animal protein that we need certain vegetables periodically?
No.
No phytochemicals, vitamin C.
The proof for the vitamin C is an interesting one. There are two things about that. The practical one is the Inuit Eskimos didn't have access to any significant vitamin C in the form of any plant matter. They were very much we'll call it carnivorous eating group, and able to get some plant matter at times. the animal-based diet, animal-based food, meat actually has a small amount of vitamin C in it. So you actually get an adequate amount through that. Our seafarers, historically, were able to travel around, but they were plagued by scurvy. Now, scurvy was actually... I'll come back one step. If you actually eat carbohydrate, to metabolize that, you need vitamin C. Vitamin C inhibits the inhibition of that uric acid pathway. So if you actually get good levels of vitamin C, that will bring down some of that. So remember I talked about fructose gets converted to uric acid, which inhibits nitric oxide. Vitamin C will actually inhibit some of that action, which is Mother Nature brilliantly. Eat the fruit. It's going to poison you with the uric acid, but I'm going to give you a bit of vitamin C to actually inhibit the poison pathway. And I'm going to give you some vitamin D if you have it seasonally. So it's beautifully tied up. But there's been some work over time now to show that actually you don't need vitamin C if you're on a low-carb diet. So if you actually... And again, those seafarers, those explorers way back actually, who weren't feeding their sailors gruel, a carbohydrate, grain-based food, actually travelled around the world without the need of vitamin C. So James Cook, who formerly discovered Australia, but is known as one of the great explorers of the world, his ability to travel the world, because they worked out that they could take limes with them to get rid of scurvy. But if they didn't eat the gruel, they probably didn't need the limes. So again, if the Nordic explorers that preceded them explored right across the northwest. What is the Northwest Channel? It goes across top of Canada.
I'm not sure offhand.
Hey, you're the Canadian. I'm just trying to understand your history of it. I think it's the Northwest Channel. But they explored that, and arguably that whole migration from the Nordic countries across via Greenland into across the top of Canada and then into Russia is actually partly related. They were able to get across there, but they weren't having a lot of carbohydrate. So those explorers, and we go. Oh, now my dates are not clear on this. I'll claim. There's a great book by Jared Diamond called Guns, Germs and Steel. I've got a lot of time for Jared Diamond, but nonetheless, he talks about that. But clearly that exploration pathways, he doesn't talk about the carbohydrate aspect, but they got across there, and the only way you can travel that amount of distance, whether or not it's by land or sea, was that you had to have an animal-based diet, because you weren't going to be able to have your carbohydrates, because you would have gotten scurvy. Again, I often draw a long bow, but it's an interesting hypothesis to then explore. So, do we need vitamin C? No, is a simple answer. If you're not having things which produce inflammation, then you require a lot less vitamin C. So the things which I think cause inflammation is the carbohydrate. Carbohydrate comes with its problems. You need the vitamin C as an antidote. Don't have the carbohydrate, you don't need the antidote. And all the other phytonutrients and things that are talked about are actually rich in an animal-based product. The thing which we haven't talked about, which keeps coming up, however, is a thing called fiber. And again, I think fiber is completely overrated. It's a carbohydrate. It's a non-digestible carbohydrate. It's the celluloses which actually then enter into the hindgut, and they're used for the gut flora. And then the gut flora generate other breakdown products, which are the micronutrients that we require. Now, I don't. You've worked out. I probably don't mind being controversial. It's not that I'm trying to be controversial. It's just that virtually everything in this field is like a house of cards. You poke the house of cards, it just falls down on the first question. And the fact is that we've been completely brainwashed by this propaganda for over 100 years that, we've got to have our sugar, we've got to have our breakfast cereal, we've got to have our carbohydrates, we've got to have our fiber, we've got to reduce our salt. It's all just made up. And when you work out why it's been made up and who's been behind it, then that's a whole nother pathway. So fiber, because again, my whole arguments are based on biochemistry. That's the basic of all medical degrees. It's the basic of all science degrees. It's the base of our understanding of life itself. It's based on biochemistry. So fiber is actually, again, one of those things that we don't actually need large amounts of in our diet. And if you've got inflammatory bowel disease, they actually put you on low fiber diets. If you actually increase the amount of fiber, it actually tends to bind up stuff inside the bowel and create more blockages and more inflammation. The gut microbiome is fed by that, but then that if you actually combine that with fructose, you actually get this thing called a bloated stomach. And a lot of people who've given up sugar and cut down on the amount of fiber actually end up with less bloating in their stomach, in their abdomen, sorry, not their stomach. So the whole argument of fiber, I think, is a bit of a con. I'm on a very low fiber diet. I've actually been banned by Belinda from putting a picture up every day on Instagram of what I've dropped into the toilet bowl. I thought here's a very productive bowel without any fiber in it. So everyone will be very happy to know that Belinda bans me from certain things. But it is actually interesting that you don't need. And Paul Mason here in Australia has done a talk on it. Zoe Harcum's done a talk on it. They're both dear friends. The talks that I would have liked to have done, but it's covered in great detail about the myth of fiber. So if the fiber story is a myth, okay, how come? So, and I think it is, and I think it's the last bastion of survival that the cereal industry have, because we've got the cereal industry on sugar. We don't need sugar. We've got them on carbohydrate. And so the only thing they keep pushing us down, literally shoving down our throats, is the fiber message. Got to have fiber, got to have fiber, got to have fiber. And I think it's made up. So here in Australia, 3 years ago, we had a press release from the Deputy Minister of Health, named by a fellow named David Gillespie. So again, if people want to fact check me, they can. So he came out with a press release saying that we need to increase the amount of fiber in our diet. And you went, okay, that's an interesting statement. And at the bottom of the press release is this statement has been written by Kellogg's. So we've got our health ministry actually doing press releases based on propaganda and marketing put out by the Kellogg's Cornflake Company. I mean, that's how bad this situation has gotten to. So again, where the fiber thing, do you know where the fiber story get the benefits? Have you heard of Burkitt?
No.
So Burkitt was a missionary in Africa, and he was an English, I think he was British, might have been a US, but anyway, he was traveling around Africa, and he noted that the African natives did big sloppy poos on the side of the road. It was always big, and that the observation that was in the US that bowel cancer was on the increase, and people had small, dry, hard poos. Their bowel motions were significantly different. And so Burkitt made the observation as a sort of missionary, self-proclaimed medico, that big sloppy poos actually meant that you didn't end up with bowel cancer. It's just pure association. But he took that premise back to the US, and so therefore the fibre thing was born, literally. But how did we come to believe it? Well, in fact, Burkitt was then funded by the cereal industry to travel around the US for the next 30 years with this story. And there it is. Bang, all of a sudden we believe in fibre being critical. So the gut microbiome is the latest phase of that. We've got to have a healthy gut microbiome. And I agree with that, but I don't think fibre is the answer. You will get a healthy gut microbiome by having a wide variety of natural seasonal foods which are available to you. And that's been observed for millennia in native tribes where they've actually got a much healthier gut microbiome than we do in Western society. So again, I think it's the dog wagging, what do you call it, the tail wagging the dog. The food industry wants us to believe in the fibre thing so it continue to actually produce its food and we continue to buy it. And all this work done around the gut microbiome sort of just keeps potentiating it, when in fact it's not the fibre we need. We need to have a good, healthy diet without actually all the chemicals that are coming in it with the processed food. Am I right or wrong with it? All I can say is that those people who do the exact opposite of the food guidelines and they reduce their sugar, their carbohydrate, their seed oils, they move towards less plant-based diet, more animal-based diet, end up with less inflammation, better metabolic health, less insulin resistance, less food addiction behaviours, and they're not getting as much fibre in it as they were before. But then that's an entire industry that I'm upsetting with the gut microbiome. But I mean, it's very hard not to upset industries when I start having these conversations because it's just biochemistry.
To get into the detail there, you've debunked the fiber myth.
Now, I've got an opinion on the fibre myth.
I want to get into the nuance here. Do we need any fiber? If we take that all the way to the extreme, being carnivore, and doing that for an extended period of time or extended fasting, not giving the gut microbiome any fiber, what happens then?
Well, I think it's very hard to have no fibre. Okay, I get it. If you're pure carnivore, you're not getting any fibre. Here's an example: babies. Babies fed on breast milk, pure carnivore, really, aren't they?
Yeah.
Got big sloppy poos. They thrive. I like experimenting on babies. We can talk about that, at least theoretically experimenting. But then I'll also understand that breast milk has some non-digestible carbohydrate in it, which acts like fibre. So I think you need very, very little. I don't think we need the amounts that we're getting that are argued. So even there is always some non-digestible carbohydrate even in animal-based foods, but it's very small. So I don't think you can ever have zero fibre, which is really just another name for non-digestible carbohydrate. But do we need the amount that we're recommended? No. And I think there have been several studies now looking at very low fibre diets in the management of bowel disorders in particular, showing significant improvements in constipation, inflammatory bowel disease. And that's, again, so babies thrive without any significant fibre. There's just an example.
So you've touched on the fact that meat does contain a tiny bit of vitamin C and a bit of fiber. Is the fiber part, does that come from the glycogen in meat, or how is that there?
Oh, yeah, it's the gristle. It's that gristly. If you want to eat the cartilage bits of it, it's in there. And again, that's if we're going to eat respectfully, I'm a great believer in eating nose to tail on an animal. Got some farming friends who supply us in lamb, which is fabulous. I give medical consultations to them and they bring up lamb and venison, and they said, they know that I'm after some heart, liver. Don't like kidneys that much, but nonetheless, they can supply me with that. But I said, can we get some tongue? Because tongue is very rich, and so they've just been, we've been chatting about how to harvest the tongue. But again, that's eating the animal from nose to tail. It's actually just, then you get everything. And, and to be fair, once you boil down the animal bones for a broth of something like that, then you're getting all those other, you're going to be getting some of those small amounts of fibre. But do I need the fibre? I don't think I do need the fibre. I don't believe I can get away with having a zero fibre intake.
And when it comes to the glycogen piece, though, within meat, getting a small amount of carbohydrate through that, is the fiber piece tied to that, or is it separate just through the gristle?
No, I don't think there's no fibre in glycogen. It'll actually be in the bits of gristle.
Right.
And I have some nuts. So therefore, nuts have got fibre in them. But again, I'm not having masses of that. And I think I'm addicted to food. I think we're all addicted to food in some respects. And I used to be a fat kid, and I used to be sugar driven, and I like eating. People say, "What do you think about fasting?" I said, "I actually like eating. I don't like fasting that much." And for me, I don't eat a lot, but I like getting up and having food in the morning. I won't call it breakfast because that's just breaking your fast. Again, that's a politicized term, breakfast. Again, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Have you heard that term?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Who came up with that?
Probably Kellogg.
Yeah, the Kellogg's fraternity. It was actually Ellen G. White and the Kellogg's fraternity, and Leonard Cooper, actually. I think it was Leonard Cooper, but she was working for the Kellogg's group at the time. And she was the person who formed the American Dietetics Association and wrote all the textbooks for the American Defense Forces and then for textbooks for nutrition for the next 40 years. So breakfast is the most important meal of the day is, in fact, a marketing term from the breakfast cereal industry. But it's part of our belief system. Belinda breaks her fast at lunchtimes. She tends not to eat in the mornings. She's an intermittent faster by definition. Has done it for decades. But because I've had a busy work schedule, I actually think I like getting up and having something in the morning because I don't know when my next meal is going to be. But since I've been low carb keto, I actually don't even worry when the next meal is.
When do you finish eating at night?
Do
you have a certain window you don't worry about in the morning, but at night do you fast at all before you go to bed?
So I'm not a purist, so I'll probably have something 8, 9 o'clock at night. Last night, I'm a great believer, eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full, or stop before you're full. That's sort of my philosophy. And and once you give up sugar and carbs, you actually realize that your body, you'll be far more able to sense what you need. So I'll wake up in the mornings, I'll go, actually, I need protein today. I need a bit more fat. I'm sensitive to that. So last night I was going, I think I need some cheese. So our daughter was around 9:30 at night. I just pulled out a chunk of cheese and just ate the cheese because my body told me I wanted a bit of protein and maybe a little bit of fat. And I think cheese is fabulous for that aspect because it actually, it's very low glycemic index, which means that you're not going to, if I was diabetic, then it's not going to raise any blood sugars. It's going to give me protein. It's going to give me a bit of energy. But no, I don't normally snack on cheese at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. Just that's what you've asked me a specific question. But again, and once you eat this way, as I say, you're very sensitive to it, sensitive to what your body actually requires. And going back in time, I'll use the pizza example. Like if you eat a pizza, it's got lots of topping on it and all sorts of things, but it's actually high in energy, but it's actually low relatively in protein, healthy fats, certainly low in micronutrients. And traditionally, if you eat one pizza, you haven't fulfilled your metabolic requirements, your fuel requirements. So what do? You eat another pizza. There's carbohydrates and sugars in there which actually drive your behavior to still keep you hungry. But I think once you start eating to your metabolic requirements, not your energy needs, then all of a sudden your diet's under control. And that once you take, like sugar is, again, fructose will drive behavior, will overcome, that sweetness will overcome all of your taste buds on the tongue. I don't know if yourself or others have actually noted that when you actually give up sugar, you can taste food differently.
I haven't noticed that specifically,
Pardon?
but I haven't totally given it up.
Oh, that's all right. It'll come when you get old like me. But it's like a smoker giving up smoking. They can taste their food again. And if you ever listen to people who've actually given up sugar, they feel they can taste food again. Food tastes better because you're not having this overwhelming. And I used to put tomato sauce on everything. I just grew up just pouring ketchup, tomato sauce, whatever you want to call, just across food. I've even been known as a university student to put tomato sauce on ice cream. No, it's horrible, but you do horrible things as I used to be the cake judge at the hospital, so I'm the greatest hypocrite. But I'm repenting my ways. I wouldn't take kids' plasters off unless they brought me a chocolate cake. They'd break their arm, and they say, "Doctor, how long am I on plaster?" I said, "Well, you've got 6 weeks in plaster, or you've got 5 weeks in plaster if you bring me a chocolate cake." And so my clinics were full of chocolate cakes because people respond to bribery, so or blackmail. Was that bribery from bribery from their aspect, blackmail from mine. And look, and I apologise to all of my patients for 30 odd years where I told them they had to bring me a chocolate cake. And I apologise to all the staff and the charities that I gave all those chocolate cakes away to. There's an interesting point. Because I think the biochemistry is actually so straightforward. When you actually take it apart and go, okay, this is what we require. And a lot of our work's been on trying to work out what's blocking this message of real food. And it's the processed food industry, it's the pharmaceutical industry, and it's religious ideology, which come together. So if you've got something which is so simple, what's stopping this message from going out, apart from the vested interest? What happens at a personal level? Do you know what that is?
I mean, there's, on a personal level, you get hijacked and we talked about hormones change and dopamine and...
Far simpler than that. Now, I know you've got kids.
Mm-hmm.
What's the most important thing? So when you've made a mistake, admit it.
For sure.
Say sorry, and I'll move on. And we teach it to our children. Sorry, you've stuffed up here. You've stuffed up. Say sorry to your sibling or whatever. Say to your mother or whatever. You've made a mistake. You don't do it again. Admit that you've made the mistake, and we can all move on. We can all learn from that. And we've actually said sorry to our children for the food we gave them. Sorry, guys, got that one wrong. But we'd like to, let's all move on. And we've seen the health benefits for our children. And now it's really interesting watching our grandchildren grow up in a relatively low-carb environment, watching our daughters' pregnancies as a low-carb environment, without health problems for the mother or the child. But as a medical profession, as healthcare professionals, when was the last time your doctor actually looked you in the face and said, actually, sorry, I was completely and utterly wrong there? This doesn't happen. And whether or not that's an arrogance or a self-belief or a worry of litigation, it's the sooner we as a health profession actually admit we got it wrong, we can then move on. And the last time the medical profession said sorry was over thalidomide, which must be 50, 60 years ago now. And I think from rough recollection, 10,000, 10 to 20,000 people around the world affected by thalidomide. Consider that to the billions of people which are now affected by metabolic health issues. This is a huge problem. The first thing I think we all need to do is to actually go, oops, sorry, got it wrong. Our textbooks were wrong. Our teachers were wrong. That generational education that we've been exposed to since 1910, which is the Flexner report, which changed everything from the US and Canada, and then the rest of the world, that we got it wrong because propaganda was there at the beginning in 1910 with Rockefeller and Carnegie, and then the Flexner report and the birth of the pharmaceutical industry, the reduction of holistic health as an educational facilities. I think it closed just over 50 universities in the US and Canada alone, just based on the Flexner report. So holistic medicine went out the window, preventative health was put right down, and the birth of the pharmaceutical and arguably the surgical industry just exploded. And then the food industry with its dietary guidelines was 1923. October 23, 1917, just to be exact, with the birth of the American Dietetics Association, and then all the textbooks being written for the rest of the world, and then the formation of the Canadian Dietetics Association, the Australian, the British, that all followed suit on the American model. Again, I mentioned Leonard Cooper. Leonard Cooper had been working for John Harvey Kellogg. This religious ideology of vegan vegetarianism came through, and so all the textbooks were like that. And that's generational education. So we struggle to question our teachers. We certainly struggle to question our textbooks because we believe those. They must be right. They've been thoroughly reviewed and edited, and they've stood the passage of time. But when you realise that they were written by the pharmaceutical industry and the food industry, here's a little one. Belinda came across this recently. At that very first American Dietetics Association, when it was formed, they had a meeting. They'd made a decision. I think there were about 50 women there. I'm not being sexist. That's just what there were, 50 women. They had a meeting. I think it was probably 6 weeks' notice, 8 weeks' notice that they were going to have this form up and then develop the association. At that first meeting, half a dozen food industry companies were there to support them, even before they'd formed. So the food industry, very smart. They wanted to be there at day one. And I wasn't there to see the checkbooks, how much money, but nonetheless, there was influence on day one of the formation of the American Dietetics Association, which has then flowed on to continue the critical role of the food industry in dietetic information for the world. The formation of most of the journals around nutrition were by the food industry, for the food industry. They were all about, the vast majority of all of these articles is about improving quality of food, profitability, palatability, transportability. And somewhere, which was really nutrition science, was there to improve the product and for profitability of the food industry. Somewhere along the line, that margin's been blurred. So we believe that nutrition science is the same as medical science. It's not. Medical science is for the improvement of patients. Sure, it's actually being swayed by the pharmaceutical industry dramatically about what medications are going to do the job, but it's there for the betterment of the patient. Nutrition science has been for the betterment of industry. So what time do we start believing nutrition science is actually medical science? I don't know when it happened, but those margins have certainly been blurred.
Crazy. Follow the money.
Or the religious ideology. That's the strange thing, because when you come, and again, I'm known for talking about this. This is largely Belinda's work. When you realise that the dietary guidelines of the world, the Western world, have effectively been influenced by Seventh-day Adventist beliefs. Again, John Harvey Kellogg's worked for the founding family, the Ellen G. White, and he was put through medical school. And then he had the beliefs that the Seventh-day Adventists believe essentially fruitarian initially, but essentially a vegan concept, because they believe in the Garden of Eden diet, which is fruit, nuts, and seeds. It's not even vegetables. And they start twisting that a little bit around to actually make it into cereals, calling cereals wheat and rice to actually be fruit, which is pretty loose, but nonetheless, they've actually got that. But essentially, it's a vegan fruitarian diet. And that's their belief. And their belief is that when the world turns into vegan vegetarian, or believes in this vegan discussion and moves towards it, then Christ will return. Now, that's fine for you to have your beliefs. And we're not church bashers or religious bashers on this one. But this group, which is small in number, less than 20 million, is the second biggest educator in the world after the Catholic Church. They see medical evangelism as the right arm of the church. They are a major push into the developing nations of the world, enormous influence right through the dietary guidelines of the world since 1917. And we've got some of their early textbooks of the American Dietetics Association, and you read them, and they're demonizing meat and they're celebrating plant-based. And when you realize that Seventh-day Adventist Church started the cereal industry of the world in Battle Creek, Michigan, they also started the Western soy industry. John Harvey Kellogg started the alternate meat industry with the nut analogs. Again, this is all around 1900. Incredibly powerful, but that influence has then flown into the textbooks and it's flown into the medical education and that generational education, so that we start believing this non-science. But it's been there for over 100 years, and trying to unpick that. So again, I come back, if the biochemistry is fascinating, but that doesn't change. It hasn't changed in millennia. It's what we've been told and pushed is actually from industry. Seventh-day Adventist Church owned 14 different food industries, massive. It's so well funded. They've gotten into extremely high positions in the World Health Organization. 6 presidents and prime ministers of Polynesian countries are actually Seventh-day Adventists. Now, you might actually think that I'm being paranoid or conspiracy theory. However, in 2019, in a journal called Religion, so very senior people of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there's an article where they actually acknowledge all of this, the role of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in manipulating the dietary guidelines of the world. It's not quite worded that, but effectively that's what they say. And in it, they quote Belinda's work. So Belinda's actually still in touch with very senior people in the church, in their educational aspects, very senior people currently involved in the church, a lot of past members, and they openly admit to it. So again, once you understand where the non-science is coming from, where the propaganda is coming from, and it is industry, pharmaceutical, and religious ideology, now I understand why I was conned in my medical education. Now I understand why the food pyramid is wrong. Now I understand why my food plate, whatever's coming out of the government, is being influenced by those factors. Because if the government admit they're wrong, it's a classic thing. Just admit we got it wrong and we can all move forward. And the obstacles towards low carb, particularly in diabetes, have been massive, except it's effective. But nobody makes any money out of it, except the local farmer.
That's all really fascinating. I want to clarify something I stated earlier, the fact that I was still consuming sugar. I'm talking about whole food sugar in that case. And I want to come back to fructose and tie a couple loose ends there. One being when you talked about our modern fruit being hybridized and changed, given that knowledge, for people that still want to include some carbohydrates and eat better choices when it comes to fruit, you mentioned berries, so I'm assuming that must be one of them. But what are the fruits that are available to people that are less tinkered with when it comes to the fiber and sugar like you talked about before?
I don't think anything is. I think they've all been tinkered with significantly. Most vegetables are unpalatable if you go back 100 years. They need to be boiled and produced, and most of the phytins and the lectins in them needed to be processed out of them by boiling, and with that also went the micronutrients. My personal, so I'll have some blueberries or raspberries, and again, only a few, because I like the taste of it. If you freeze those, because people freeze their berries, within 2 months, they've lost all their phytonutrients and benefits. So don't think that having your frozen berries is actually helpful for your health. It's actually, if you're going to believe the marketing on those micronutrients. I think avocados they're a fruit which is very low in sugar, has some fats in it. I think that's actually less tampered. Mind you, there's so many different breeds of avocados, but effectively they're not pushing up the amount of fructose in those because they're not naturally there. Tomatoes are a fruit as well, but again, tomatoes have been completely manipulated with all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So is there a fruit that hasn't been tampered with much that you can buy at the supermarket? Probably not. But again, the five a day fruit and veg, that's a marketing term that goes back to 1991 on the Baja Peninsula in California, where there was a meeting between the American Cancer Council, American Cancer Society, and 40 well-meaning food industry partners, including Walmart. I think McDonald's was there, to look at the role of food and cancer. And it was the observation at that time in 1991 was that those people who had higher intakes of fruit and veg had lower cancer rates. And that's where, and again, Zoe Harcum, I think she came up with the only concept of the 5 a day was someone, they're trying to work out how many you need to have, and someone put up their hand and they said, well, there's 5 fingers there. But because there's no science in it. In some countries, it's 7 a day. Some places it's 3 plus 2. Some places it's 5 plus 2. It's actually it's just literally made up. But it started in 1991. And I talk about the EPIC study done out of Europe, which is looking at outcomes in cancer, published in 2021, so 30 years down the track, or around that time frame. Maybe it's 2019, but it's pretty well 30-year follow-up. And it found out that those quartiles, whether or not you had high or low intakes of fruit and veg, had no difference in outcome in cancer outcomes. Now, as it turned out, when they reviewed all that data, it was actually those people that had higher socioeconomic status had lower rates of cancer, and higher socioeconomic status was reflected by them having higher intakes of fruit and veg. So it wasn't the fruit and veg that was actually the main factor, was having a higher socioeconomic status. So again, these are just when you go back in history to work out where they came up, well, who made this number up? Just who? It actually was never based on science.
Well, the problem is who has the time to go back and look at who's spending money on what research and where all this originated, what religious influence there is and political and so on. We can understand why everybody these days, as a general statement, is so metabolically unhealthy and there's so much chronic disease because of the confusion. And when people are sick, they're going to even be more tired and have less energy to look into what to do and the origins of these different guidelines. So
Well, this is
I
where
really feel for people. I say this all the time. It's a complex, corrupt, confusing world these days when it comes to healthy living and eating.
well, and who's to believe what I'm saying? And mine is just an opinion. I mean, Belinda is I think, the world expert on vested interests which are shaping dietary guidelines. Now, she fell into that because I was targeted by the food industry here in Australia. We've got their internal email saying, these 7 people are to be targeted. And and I was the only doctor on that list. So I was reported to the medical board on 3 occasions for giving the advice to stop reducing sugar. I got reported on 1 occasion for inappropriately reversing someone's diabetes. You're not allowed to do that, and certainly not on national TV when we did it. And I honestly thought this was a joke when I started getting reported, because I'm personally seeing the benefits for myself, my team, my family, my patients. Literally, people were coming into hospital with diabetic foot complications, and I just cut. And the hospital serving them ice cream 3 times a day, which is driving me insane. I said, stop that. Let's reduce the sugar. Let's give them some, I was really radical. I said, I prescribed eggs and cheese and a full-fat yogurt. I'd have to write on the medication chart that I wanted my patient prescribed them to have eggs and cheese, because the hospitals wouldn't do it. So, portions of cheese, I'd write it on the medication chart. And literally, just with that, horrendously dangerous intervention, they started healing. So, I'm seeing all those benefits, and yet I'm reported. I literally, and that's how I've literally done a PhD in nutrition/biochemistry. I don't have a PhD in it, but because I had to defend that turf, I've become quite knowledgeable in it. People can argue whether I'm right or wrong, but Belinda's research was in who's behind reporting me, and then she's just ended up going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole. And that's why she knows so much about this stuff. And I'm just scratching the surface of it with these comments at the moment. And I recommend to people go along and have a look at her work on YouTube. And again, she just scratches the surface of what they've been up to for 100 years, what they've been up to. People talk about, the origins of the food pyramid, but it goes back way before that. It goes back to temperance movement times in the mid-19th century, 1850, 1860, when we started developing some of our current food practices. And so temperance movement at that time, that was a time when industry was taking off and people were moving from the farms into the cities. To get food from out of the farms into the cities, the plant matter would rot. The animal-based foods, the animals would be slaughtered in the country, and then they had to be salted. And if they weren't salted, they ended up being a bit putrid. So you couldn't eat the meats there. The water wasn't safe to drink, so that's why the alcohol, it's a name for it, light beer, but essentially the mead, the alcohol was actually in the water. So everyone was drinking a light beer because it was sterile in comparison to the water. So as a result, everyone's half drunk, they're eating poorly, the food salted to actually make it safe. When it wasn't safe, then people would get sick. And I think that's the origins of the demonization of salt. goes back to temperance movement. But right in the midst of it, this temperance movement was the origins of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and it just then flowed on to then becoming the cereal industry, invented for bland food, dietary guidelines, metabolic health disaster we have now.
So given all that and how deeply entwined these roots are of the current information we're being fed, what are we supposed to do?
I'll summarize it in one sentence. I've been silly enough, brave enough, whatever, to actually summarize the dietary guidelines for the world in one sentence. I don't know if you heard me say it. I quoted a bit. We should be eating fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on our environment and culture, avoiding added sugar and processed food. That's it. You can read into that whatever you want. I've described there an evolutionary diet. That's the way we evolved. It's the way we've evolved over a couple of million years, in particular the last couple of 100,000. We've tampered with it for the last 10,000 years since the agricultural revolution. And once we started eating far more grains, then we've started introducing health issues. And we can look at our skeletons to see that. Once we've started introducing seed oils into the equation in the last 100 years in particular, certainly the last 50 years, then we've seen an escalation of our inflammation. So if I come back to that root group, that pathway, eat fresh, local, seasonal, whole food, then we're safe. We take food miles out of that. Based on our environment means we're talking about latitude and vitamin D. And then taking sugar and processed food out, I can't simplify it down more than that. You may want to add in processed food into that. You may want to add in sugar into it. You may want to add in fruit, but you're going to pay a price for it. So that's what the individual can do. So that's a decentralized concept. It means you're going to be taking money away from the corporates. You're going to be supporting your local farmers. That's a good thing. Because we need to, in this huge world that we have, ultimately our survival is going to be dependent on supporting our local industry, our local farmers. So I've got no trouble, you can't quite hear out the window. We've got our own sheep and chickens, and that can't be any more fresh, local, and seasonal than what they produce. So that's what do you do? That's just common sense. The moment you go to the supermarket, you're going to be exposed to advertising. The moment you open a magazine or a newspaper or turn on the media or your computer, you're going to be exposed to advertising, propaganda. So I ask people to come back to common sense, which has been abandoned by the vast majority of society, but that's just a little bit of cynicism. Everything else is a complication beyond common sense.
I said there was a couple loose ends I wanted to tie up when it came to fructose, and this one ties into one of the other big three we talked about early on, refined carbs as well. For somebody right now that is having a diet that still has quite a bit of refined carbs and fructose, and now they're tuned into what we're talking about here today, the low carb diet and lifestyle, how do they go about making that switch? Do you recommend doing it slowly over time? Because somebody who has been on a diet like that for years and years, I can imagine trying to switch it like a light switch overnight is going to be very challenging. So how do people do that in a practical sense?
A light bulb moment for me in 2012 or whatever was when I came across this stuff. If you're insulin resistant or overweight, 30% of the carbohydrate you eat gets converted into fructose. It's called a polyol pathway. So fructose is not good. Glucose, carbohydrate, gets converted into fructose. Glucose in excess, and I've made an argument of 4 grams or 1 teaspoon of glucose starts having a negative effect on the system. Pushes up your insulin levels, gets stored into fat, creates inflammation in the blood vessels. So the very first way to go about this is to actually understand the problem, educating yourself. Seed oils just complicate the whole layer of that inflammation because then they become oxidized and that creates even more inflammation on top of the glucose and fructose combination. So your decision as to what you want to do is really based on what your personal requirements are. Some people, and there's a whole variety, there's a whole spectrum out there. So if you've got very poor metabolic health, you might want to go hardcore. If you think you're pretty healthy and you've got no major issues, you may just want to move into this slowly. If you go into it quickly, then you're going to be exposing yourself to what's called keto flu. It's not really a flu at all. It's not contagious or whatever. It just means you're going to be moving from a state of carbohydrate dependence. One of the first things happens, if you eat a lot of carbohydrate, then your body produces a lot of insulin to store that as fat. It's also inflammatory. It also has tumor promotion insulin. But that fat storage thing is that you will actually, it binds a lot of salt. So if you actually reduce your insulin quickly, your body will excrete a lot of salt, and it will do that with a lot of fluid. So some people who just decide to go hardcore low carb will lose a few kilos in a few days. They'll be peeing it out because of the salt. And if you're losing that salt, you're actually going to feel crook and you feel headachy, and you get that's called the keto flu, and it can come on within a few days and can give you headaches and can last for a week, 10 days. So if you are going to go hardcore at it, I think you need to be A, aware what's going to happen, B, bump your salt intake up. And again, this is a whole myth about salt. James Di Nicolatino, always got to say that slowly, he's got a great book called The Salt Fix. James has gone into this in great detail. And again, a lot of myths, a lot of understanding of what salt. We're born of the ocean. If you believe in evolution, then I think we've come out of the ocean. Our salt's going to mimic salt water. We need more salt. If you've got good kidney function, you will excrete that salt in your kidneys. And so for the vast majority of people, it's almost impossible to have too much salt in your diet because you'll just get rid of it. We've arguably got a J curve, meaning so that if you actually, and it's like a tick actually. If you have too little salt in your diet, there's a lot more complications. There's a bliss point probably higher than what the recommendation is. And if you increase your intake dramatically over time, you might have some minor changes, but it's nowhere near as much as Heart Foundations have made it out to be. Most people's kidneys are working overtime to maintain the amount of salt they've got. Most people can easily throw on a bit more salt on their food. And if you're not eating ultra-processed food, you probably need to put more salt in there. Because A, you're not having the insulin on board, and B, it's not coming with a salt load anyway. So we sprinkle salt on our food all the time. Good quality salt, throw it on. And I'll pee it out if I'm having too much. So again, that scenario, if you're having keto flu, you're going to need to increase your salt because A, you've stopped your salt intake, and B, your body's going to be getting rid of a whole lot of salt which has been hanging around with the insulin. If you're going to do it slower, which is what happened for us. I mean, the story with me or in our household was I came across the perils of sugar, first of all, which was, okay, so I said, okay, I'm going to cut down the amount of sugar in the house. Then it was the seed oils. So then we got rid of those. And then I said, hang on, carbohydrate. There's the polyol pathway, 30, 40% getting flipped back into fructose. Learning more and more about insulin resistance. And hopefully the population realises that what we're learning about this whole topic of insulin resistance is 10 years old. I'm very proud to be part of that modern framework of actually going forward with it. But it's brand new knowledge for the vast majority of people. So I then said to Belinda, okay, all those carbs have got to go. And to use a term from Karen Zinn from New Zealand, the empty pantry, full fridge. Belinda looked at me on that day. She said, you've gotten rid of sugar. You've got rid of the oils. Getting rid of the carbohydrates. If you take the bacon out, you're out. So bacon's okay. Right? Despite the story about nitrites being bad for you. Again, I can't have nitrites in your diet because in bacon. Well, there's actually more in cruciferous vegetables than there is in bacon. So it's just, again, can't have bacon because it's full of nitrates and whatever. But actually, your vegetables have got more. So hang on, how can you have good nitrates in that and bad nitrates in others? It's the same chemistry. So that's just all BS propaganda again. So people can decide what they want to do. Again, I don't force anyone what to eat. But if you've got a bad diet and you've got poor metabolic health and you've got diabetes or pre-diabetes and you've got a large waist circumference and you're inflamed, maybe before you take another packet of pills, you should look at what you're eating. What you eat, I would recommend being the opposite of what we've been told. Cut down on your sugar, cut down on your carbs, get rid of the seed oils, look towards more animal-based product, which is going to be complete. Cut down on some of those plant-based. I'm not saying you've got to become a carnivore straight away. I'm sort of saying that it's a transition, it's a learning. And I've got that in some of my talks where I think, if you take most people most of society, and I can say that now because it's 93.2% on the last study done on it, were metabolically unwell. So that means 6% of the population are healthy, or 6.8%, 93.2%. So if we take 93.2% of the population, I think they should all look at their diet. My journey was that I started and I was metabolically unwell. I then ate by the food pyramid. Then I tried to outrun that because it didn't help me. It's one of my sayings: if you eat by the food pyramid, you're going to die by the food pyramid. And along the way, you're going to look like the food pyramid. It's just that triangular shape. And then I moved towards fresh, local, seasonal food, which is called low carb, healthy fat. And then I moved towards keto, and now most people lecturing in this space are almost carnivore. Just some people move a different pathway. They're sick, and then they move towards vegan, a more plant-based diet, which improves their health initially because they've gotten rid of all the crap food. But over time, they will be micronutrient deficient. You can't get your B12s, you can't get certain vitamins. And you're not going to get enough iron. And so over a period of time, they actually get sick and move towards low carb, healthy fat, keto, carnivore. And I say that because some of the most vocal people in this low carb carnivore space used to be vegans. They go, hang on, and they got sick, they got it wrong. And I'm okay with people wanting to be vegan because I think they're taking interest in their health. They've taken an interest in the environment, even though it's been swayed by vested interest to make those beliefs. But they're interested in the outcome. And so therefore, I think Sean Baker's got a site called Recovering Vegans, which, again, it's supporting people who actually realise they've made a mistake. They're on the journey to better health and going up that pathway. So I think it's for everyone. It's a journey. The very first journey step is to actually look. If you're going to go on a trip, what's the first thing you do about it? You research it, and then you decide if you're going to take the slow train or the fast train. So again, that's where people go. Start looking into this. Start seeing whether or not myself and others and you are actually, completely making up this nonsense, or do they sound rational? And I think we sound rational. We might be coming up with some bizarre comments, which is against mainstream, but in fact, the process of how I've gotten to that didn't happen overnight. I mean, in some respects, some people, you can go hardcore now because we've got it all in one package. If you eat sugar, carbs, seed oils in excess, you're going to be sick and inflamed. Drop the whole lot of them, and you're going to improve. And that's so that's going from a standard, diet, standard inflammatory diet to keto straight away. Along that way, you're going to feel a bit crook because you're going to go through keto flu, fat adaptation. And the critics of this say, if you do that, your performance, athletic performance is going to go down. But that transition takes 6 to 8 weeks. Most of the studies looking at that are done for over 3 to 4 weeks. And so it's criticised, that doesn't work because their performance goes down. No, they're going through a period of fat adaptation. I'm allowed to tell this story, but we had a dietitian that was working for us, and right at the beginning, she said, I'm going back 12 years, so switched on young woman, triathlete. She said, I think we can improve diabetes. I went, yes, of course we can. So she wanted to travel that path. So we actually started a business, which we gave to the team because I don't want to be tested with, accused of vested interests. She was a triathlete. I gave her a book called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance by Steve Finney and Jeff Bolick. Short book, easy read. They've got 2 books on that topic, but this is way back. Anyway, so she read it. She said, I'm going to do that. Now, at that point in time, she'd been doing triathlons for several years. She could not change her times. She was ranked reasonably well in Australia. And so she decided to do that, and 6 weeks later do a half iron, we call it an iron person now, but knocked 45 minutes off her time, which is massive. So she'd plateaued and could not reach it. So knocked 45 minutes off her time. And then, so improved her swim leg, bike leg, run leg. 6 months later, she then did the Australian Championships and came third. Her career was plateaued until she flipped over and keto adapted, became a fat burner. The tragedy of all that is that she met a guy at that Nationals and has now married him and got kids and moved away from Tasmania. So I lost the dietitian because she keto adapted. So that's a complication of it. You may find that your person that you're working with who's completely on board actually gets so fit and well that she goes and marries some person in another part of the country. So, but what I'm sort of saying, if performance, which is critical, some people say your performance is going to drop off, is actually it takes a period of keto adaptation. There are 3 AFL, Australian football teams here in Australia that have moved down this pathway. They are now known as the running teams. They tend to run out the opposition in the 4th quarter. Some of the military forces are taking this on board, and there's one special forces guy said, when we're doing keto, we are keener. I thought that was a really interesting word. He just felt they're more alert, they can better fueled, fitter, run longer and stronger. Bearing in mind, so if you actually, protein and carbohydrates, about 4 calories per gram. Fat's about 9. So people say, fat's bad for you because it's got more calories. Imagine if you're a soldier and you can carry a kilo of food on you. You can have a choice of carrying what's that, 9 calories per gram or 4 calories per gram, you can carry more than twice as much fuel with you for a given task. So it means you can you're better fueling your soldiers. They're responding better. So, and a lot of work's being done in that space now. And Dom D'Agostino in, I think, Florida is doing a lot of work in that space. Received a lot of money to work with Defence Forces on that spot. So again, this doesn't happen overnight. If people want to actually expect they're going to feel better overnight, it doesn't happen. Your blood pressure is going to improve. You're going to lose a few kilos of weight because of the fluid, but the transition to better health is going to be over a couple of months. And I say to people, what blood tests do we do? So forget blood tests. How do you feel? And virtually everyone says they feel better. So that's probably the best measure of all. If we want to go down to blood tests and investigation results, there are a whole lot of tests that can be done. But I think that's how do you feel? What do you actually? That's what you asked about transition. What do you want to do? And if you want to go hardcore, okay, this is the way to do it. If you want to do it slow, that's fine as well.
No, you illustrated nicely the point I was trying to address. The fact that there is this transition period for somebody going from a standard type diet to what we're talking about today. And just to make people aware, not to keep the junk in their diet, but maybe keep some of the whole food, carbohydrates, healthier choices in for a period of time as you're transitioning if you don't want to hit the wall by making this switch overnight.
The good thing about finding all that cereals and grains and stuff in your pantry is I can feed it to the chickens. The chickens turn it into eggs and give it back to me.
Arguably not the same quality, though.
Well, our chickens are carnivores, but if I want them to do anything, I give them some wheat because they're addicted to the sugar, just like we as humans are. That's a topic. Of pasture-raised animals versus farm-based animals, or factory farming to be the worst example of it. If you look at the omega-3 fatty acid composition of those meats and produce, the omega-6, not the omega-3. So linoleic acid is an omega-6 fatty acid. It's an essential fatty acid that we need to have, but it's also the inflammatory one. That's the ones I talk about in the seed oils. And our omega-6 linoleic acid levels have been steadily rising in our body tissue for over 50 years. So again, I think that's the kicker into the overall inflammatory process. And it's been measured a few times over, if you measure that between pasture-fed animals and I'll include that in wild fish as well. So pasture-fed versus farm-fed, they have a slightly higher linoleic acid level when you start feeding them grains and whatever other produce that goes in. But it's still infinitely lower than having those industrial seed oils in your normal, your vegetable oils in your food product. Bearing in mind, there is no such thing as a vegetable oil. That's a marketing term. It's an industrial oil, which they now call a vegetable oil. So if you have the luxury that we do here in Tasmania, that we can have our pasture-fed raised animals, which are going to be very low in inflammatory seed oils and higher in vitamin K2. This is about segues of one thing after another, but then we're lucky. But if you don't have that, and you have to have your animal-based product from more other sources, try and find that source which is going to be more local. Try and find that source which is going to have a better care of those animals and work towards that. But again, we're very fortunate here. I actually sort of say here in Australia, arguably most parts of Canada, you have the luxury and the privilege of actually eating fresh, local and seasonal. There are vast areas of the planet that never have that luxury. So you've got the luxury of knowledge. You've got access to this information. You have the luxury and the privilege of being in a society where you can probably access it and support it. So I just think it's an absolute crying shame that we have an obesity epidemic, sickness industry, when we're so privileged to not have it. And so it's, my criticism of my fellow man is you have a responsibility. If you've got this amount of privilege, you should have a responsibility to do the right thing by yourself and your community, because there's vast people on the planet that don't have that opportunity. We can, talk about all sorts of developing areas and war-torn spaces which have got far more greater problems. Yet we've got this problem of, incredible, increasing sickness, which is bankrupting society, communities, and not sort of just bankrupting financially, it's bankrupting them emotionally as well. It's just me drifting off on another philosophical tangent. K2. Yeah, K2. Most people heard of vitamin K. K1's the one found in leafy vegetables. K2, and that's involved in clotting, your blood clotting. K2 is one which hasn't got a lot of airtime, but I think is critical. K2 comes from pasture-fed product, whether or not it's meat, eggs, dairy. K2 is it's not really a vitamin, it's more of a hormone, but it's actually responsible for moving calcium in your body. So what it does, it moves calcium out of your arteries and into your bones. So a lot of people who may have calcium supplements, that calcium will get into your bloodstream. A lot of people might have vitamin D supplements, which will move calcium out of your bloodstream and into your tissue. But it will do that at putting that into your blood vessel walls as well as your bones. Whereas K2 actually moves it out of your blood vessels and into your bones. And that's critical. So we've got one of the ways of picking up cardiovascular disease is actually measuring the amount of calcium in the arteries. It's called coronary artery calcium score, or people who have calcified arteries. And if you have a diet high and rich in animal-based pasture-fed food, it's going to be rich in K2, and you're actually going to see that calcium move out of the arteries into the bone. And I'm aware of several people who have had their coronary artery calcium scores decrease by changing their diet to a keto, a more animal-based product. You can get K2 supplements now. But again, not surprisingly, again, we go back in the retrospectoscope. As we've moved towards this more plant-based industrial food, cereal and grain lifestyle, we've seen the development of coronary artery vessel disease, calcification. We've seen the calcification out of our vessels. So as we've actually moved away from from animal-based agriculture, because in the US have got good data on this, last 40 years, we've reduced our intake of meat right across, particularly red meat, lesser degree poultry. We've increased the amount of fruit and vegetables. We've increased the amount of cereal and grain. We've increased the amount of alternate protein sources, and all we've seen is we've increased the seed oil intake, and all we've seen is an explosion of cardiovascular disease, strokes, dementia. And so, coming back to the biochemistry, this thing called vitamin K2 does absolutely everything we need. It moves the calcium out of our arteries and back into the bone. What's the natural source? Pasture-fed, animal-based food. It's so damn simple. But, we've been blinded by all the propaganda. I know I keep coming back to it, but I mean, it's sort of a circular argument. We just keep The answer is simple. If I think most things in life, the answer is simple. If it's complicated, we haven't worked it out yet. Nature moves towards simplicity. Simplicity and balance. If you notice, there's nothing straight in nature. Everything's curved and balanced, can take tension, can take absorb stress. Nature moves towards the most balanced position. And the moment mankind gets involved, we start doing stupid stuff.
Well, speaking of mankind getting involved, we've talked about the importance of vitamin D and K2, and you just mentioned that you can supplement with it. And this is kind of the anti to what you just said, where we're taking away from simplicity when we get into supplementation and stepping away from nature and the simplicity of this whole thing. But because this modern world has changed so much, you could make the argument that sometimes we need to step in with radical things to counter this radical world we live in. What I'm getting at with all this, though, is any supplements, when somebody is eating the diet you recommend, low carb, healthy fat, any supplements that people should consider on top of that?
One, and that's probably magnesium. Not because I want you to have it, but because our food supply has been affected. So magnesium is now, when we put fertilizers, particularly potassium, into the soil, then that tends to bind magnesium. So the magnesium's in our soil, but it's not actually getting into the plant. Now, that doesn't matter if it's a vegetable or if it's into the grass and the animals eating it. Our food supply tends to be magnesium depleted. And so magnesium, it's pretty hard to overdose on. It's very hard to get a level too high in the bloodstream. Most people's magnesium levels are low if you measure it. That may be a problem with the way we're measuring, but nonetheless, that's probably. So some people, again, if they're going low carb and they want to do it acutely, I think you need to bump your salt level up. And you might, if you're getting some cramping or feeling odd, you might want to require some magnesium. And there's some of the magnesiums, particularly the magnesium oxide, tends to make you make your poo a bit runny. Some of the others don't tend to. Again, with any transition in diet, you might actually get a bit of constipation. So therefore, keep your fluid intake up. And people can go with constipation either way. But if you're going to be taking a supplement, then maybe a magnesium oxide, which will tend to make you loosen up a little bit. Now, some people are incredibly sensitive to that. Some people are not. So if you're asking me what supplements, I think you need salt if you're going to do it, mainly because your body's going to be getting rid of a bit more salt as you're actually getting, strangely enough, healthier and getting rid of that insulin overload, improving your insulin resistant state. Salt's there. If there's one supplement that we do have in the house, it's magnesium. But I don't think we take it very often.
Let's come back to the seed oils. You've touched on this, but this is one of the big three that leads to the inflammation, which is the thesis of this whole conversation. Let's talk about the physiology there of what's happening in the body and how that leads to inflammation when we're consuming these.
Okay, I suppose the difference is, got to understand what the difference is between a fat and an oil. And what it is in its state, it is whether or not it's liquid or solid at room temperature. So oils are liquid at room temperature, fats are solid at room temperature. If you lower the temperature, let's say to freezing point, oils will be still liquid. Fats are definitely solid at that. So oils tend to come from plants or seeds. Fats tend to come from animals, which are sitting at 37 degrees. What's that in Fahrenheit? 90.
8.6.
98.6. I had to remember back to when I had to learn that. So oils are liquid at cool temperature. Fats are solid at cooler temperatures. So we as humans have got fat on us, so if we actually get cooled down, we become solid. A plant, as it cools down, can't have fats in it, or can't have oil in it that gets solid because it will die. So the oil moves up and down a plant. So plants have got oils in them. Animals have got fats. A plant with that oil that goes up and down its nutrient system has to be fluid at cool temperature, and it does that by having multiple bonds in it. So fat tends to be called saturated. Oils are polyunsaturated. Poly is many. Unsaturated means double bonds within it, which create flexibility. It's like little hinge joints. So if it got lots of little hinge joints, poly, it can actually become flexible and doesn't freeze. Fat, being saturated, has no double bonds in it, and therefore it's solid. I use the analogy, it's like a brick wall versus a fluid. Monounsaturated fats have one double bond in it. So the omega-6, omega-9s, that's 6 double bonds in there, 9 double bonds, omega-12s, 12 double bonds. Omega-3s, just the 3 double bonds. But they are flexible. Now, the important thing about that is that at each double bond is its point of flexibility, but it's also a point of weakness. So it's where things can become oxidized. So an oxygen come in there, it bonds into that and creates inflammation. The analogy to a piece of steel is that oxidation of steel, it rusts, and it becomes that corrosive material. When a double bond becomes oxidized, then it becomes inflammation. It releases oxygen-free radicals in the process. So what happens is, if our bodies are predominantly saturated fat, we have no points of weakness. We've just got fat moving around at 37 degrees. So at 37 degrees, our fat in our bodies, our saturated fat, is liquid. Whereas at room temperature, it's solid. At cool temperature, it's definitely solid. Whereas an oil that gets into our bodies starts moving around the body and actually has got points of oxidation, points of weakness in it. The body, our cells actually don't almost care where the fat comes from. It just needs fat in our cell membranes. It needs fat in our brains. But that fat can either be saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, or polyunsaturated fat. And the fat in our bodies reflects our diet. That's critical. So there's no food which is actually 100% fat, saturated fat, or 100% polyunsaturated oil. Everything's got a combination of it. So if skim milk's got more saturated fat in it than red meat. The people, having skim milk can't possibly be bad for me. Well, in fact, it's got more saturated fat in it. Sardines, fish, that's good for you. No, in fact, it's got more saturated fat in it than it's polyunsaturated. So it's numbers. But what happens if we have seed oils in our diet? We're certainly increasing the amount of polyunsaturated omega-6 in particular. Again, in my talks, I do this in diagrams, so it's actually easier to understand rather than me just talking about it. The long and the short of it is, if we increase the amount of polyunsaturated fat in our diet, it will increase the amount of polyunsaturated fat in our bodies. That's the one-to-one relationship. And the more polyunsaturated fat we have in it, the more oxidizable material we have in our fat. Remembering the fat's in our cell membranes, it's our blood vessel walls and our brains. And the more oxidizable material means the more inflammation capacity we have. Now, the kicker in this is that it's been estimated that 200 years ago, we had around about 1% of the fat in our bodies being omega-6 and linoleic acid. About 100 years ago, it was about 2%. Now, for some unknown reason, and I've spoken to, I think it was Chris Kresser who looked at this, started 1950s, we started measuring the linoleic acid level in the body fat. And it's being studied for the last 70 years, over and over. And what's happened is we've moved from that 1 to 2% baseline of pre-industrial food. Now we've gone steadily up 10, 15, 20, 29, last figures around 29 to 30% of the fat in our bodies as measured is now linoleic acid. So we've had 3,000% increase in the amount. A third of our body fat is now inflammatory. It's the kindling I talked about right at the beginning. They've also measured the linoleic acid levels of breast milk in women in Western society, particularly the US, and looked at African nation women. So the breast milk in someone who's not having any industrial seed oils has very low levels of linoleic acid. The breast milk of women in industrial countries who are having higher levels of seed oils is much higher. So again, in this perfect storm I go on about, a third of the fat in our bodies now, a third of the fat in our embryos is inflammatory. An increasing amount of the fat that we're feeding women are feeding babies through breast milk is inflammatory. And don't think that the formulas are any better. They've got seed oils in them. They've got significant amounts of soy with an estrogen effect. The soy industry, baby formula, all introduced in the US by Harry China Miller, who was Seventh-day Adventist, manipulating the food science back in the 1950s. Again, the whole soy industry, the infant soy milk industry, came from the Adventists. So infant formula is no better. I'm not saying women don't breastfeed your children. I'm actually saying still breastfeed them. Just be understanding that if you've got seed oils in your diet as a mother, those seed oils are going to get into your breast milk and then they get into the baby. So again, we now have got a third of the fat in our bodies, which is not just the fat you're storing, but it's a third of the structural fat, has now got the potential to be oxidized. And that is a direct reflection of what we've been eating. Now, the bad news about that is if you decide to not have another seed oil tomorrow or today, it appears that the half-life of that might be 4 years. So it's going to take you 4 years to get half of it out of your body. Nobody knows the answer to that. Glenn Lawrence, who's a professor of oils in New York, he's written a couple of papers on it. I wrote to him. He's written a book about it. He said, read my book. I read his book. I wrote back to him, said, still haven't answered my question. And therefore, it's theorized that it's probably 4 years. So that means if you want to get rid of the inflammatory fats out of your body, it's going to take a long time. I'll give two examples here. One of our family members has had a peripheral neuropathy, diagnosed as MS. And she said, okay, I'll try all this stuff. She's on multiple medications, whatever. 4 years down the track, her neuropathy disappeared. And again, you can't prove that. But it's interesting from my aspect. 4 years, hang on, whoa, that's part of the overall thing. The other, and I tell the story of our daughter, who she was about 16 at the time, and we were flying, and she said, landed at the airport, and she said, Dad, can I have some McDonald's chips? She wanted the chips and that whole craving because it's all addictive, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, she said, she looked, and she knew exactly how I felt about seed oils and carbs and whatever. And she looked me in the eye and she said, Dad, I promise not to get pregnant for 4 years. So which father out there is not going to hand over a couple of dollars to his 16-year-old daughter who promises not to get pregnant for 4 years. So she'd made an informed decision, about seed oils. She made an informed decision about pregnancy, and I thought that was worth a couple of dollars. So I didn't have the McDonald's chips, but she did.
And just to confirm, these are essential fats. It's just the ratio we're having them in has been skewed. So the 4-year thing, it's not to get that fat in our body down to zero. It's just to bring it down to a normal level again.
What
because even healthy foods are going to have a small amount of this polyunsaturated fat.
We'll get that in our, because animals have got omega-6 in them. I mean, so I'm not saying you don't need zero. We just don't need, the dam has burst its walls. And literally we've just got this enormous amount of ultra-processed food, which is defined as sugar, excessive carbohydrate, and seed oils, that we're just it's just an onslaught. The trouble is it takes us a long time to get it out. We can cut our glucose effect down and our insulin load straight away. We can cut down the fructose effect straight away. It takes longer to get rid of some of those, the small dense LDLs, the fructose byproducts out of the way. And it takes at least 4 years to get the seed oils to start reducing. But again, we've talked about this a couple of times over. It's a journey. It's a journey. So, and so if you've eaten out at a restaurant or had takeaway food in the last 4 years, you've actually been exposed to seed oils. And so, it's tricky. But the very first thing about all of this is become educated. Or if we go to a restaurant, I'll ask the waiter, can you ask the chef what they're cooking in? Yeah. I'll go, why do you? And then they'll come back and say, well, we've got the best quality, sunflower oil, or we've got the best cotton, we've got the highest quality cottonseed oil. So, well, tell me what on this menu doesn't have that in it. And again, that's part of an education for us. Look, we live here in northern Tasmania, in Launceston. You can now go to any restaurant in Launceston and ask for a low carb option. And I'm very proud of that. People have come down here and people visit and they say, oh, in Sydney, Melbourne, mate, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. But virtually everyone here, and, it's not that hard to go to a restaurant and say, I'd like some meat and veg. I'm not a big vegetable intake. I'll just say meat and veg. Hold all the pasta and the rices and the sauces over there off to the side. So it's not hard to eat out. Even my takeaway food is, people say, what do I eat when we're traveling? I say, we go and buy a roast chicken. Roast chicken generally, apart from maybe depending what they've basted it in. But roast chicken becomes a great takeaway food.
Gary, in wrapping up, I think a good way to go about doing this is to talk about what happens in the body on a chronic basis when someone isn't adopting a low-carb diet. So they're having carbohydrates or sugars chronically over a period of time, spiking blood glucose, causing that insulin rush to come in and do its job. And what I'm getting at here is you talked about insulin resistance. I want to talk about that spectrum that can happen over a 10 to 20 year period when somebody is abusing carbs and sugars, how that physiology goes awry in the body. And then when you take that to the extreme, that's type 2 diabetes.
Well, if you leave something chronically inflamed over time, it's just going to stop working. I talk about the Maillard reaction as a cooking term. I don't know if you've heard me talk about that.
This is what I wanted to get into, the AGEs.
Yeah. So, but again, to visualize it, I've actually given this explanation to endocrinologists, diabetes specialists, and they've gone, oh, okay, yeah, I understand. I mean, why on earth am I having to give them that lecture? But anyway. So a Maillard reaction is a cooking term. Everyone's aware of it. It's the browning of food. So if you, and what happens is effectively if you combine heat and, if you put heat across glucose and protein, combines together, and it's called a glycosation of protein. Exactly the same situation occurs in our bodies. If our blood glucose goes up, and the body does everything in its capacity to keep the blood glucose down, we think about glucose being essential, and it is, but the bloodstream does not want it in it. And that's, again, those other talks. It drives it out of the bloodstream as quickly as possible under the effect of insulin primarily. So, but what happens is if you've exhausted that system, if you've moved into an insulin-resistant state, the glucose you eat, the carbohydrate you eat, spills into the bloodstream, and that blood glucose is an elevated blood glucose. That's called diabetes. And it may happen even transiently if you're haven't been given a diagnosis. But every time the blood glucose spills over into the bloodstream, 75-80% of that then gets into the tissue under osmosis, just moves across the wall. And there, under the effect of body heat, that glucose combines with the protein. You get glycosation of that protein, or glycation of that protein, and that becomes the Maillard reaction. So effectively, every time your blood glucose goes up, you are effectively toasting a little bit of your brain, a little bit of your eyes, a little bit of your kidneys, a little bit of your blood vessels, a little bit of your skin. And so we end up seeing all of those byproducts building up over time. So you might have a big carb meal now and totally unaware that you just toasted a bit of your brain. But over a period of 50 years or 70 years, not 10 to 20, then you've got dementia. If you do the same thing, then you've got chronic kidney disease. You've got eye troubles. You've got macular degeneration. You've just got the development of cataracts. You've got the development, combining that with the calcium that gets laid down in the blood vessel, then you've got cardiovascular disease. And it's a slow damaging process. It's like a Chinese water torture. You just drip, 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 and over a period of time, it just becomes an unassailable force. Now, the body's got all these mechanisms to repair it. But the trouble is, if you're impairing your repair mechanisms, you're impairing your immune system. It's all completely tied up. Their ability to repair cells, there's a thing called lymphocytes, called T killer cells. T killer cells are the first line of defense against viruses. They're also the first line of defense against cancers. When you load them with fructose, you load them with alcohol, then they don't work as well. So not only are we damaging tissue slowly and inexorably over time, we're also damaging our repair mechanisms. And it all comes back to what we're eating. So we can either change the way we eat, or we can try and medicate our way out of it. And people say, it costs time and effort. This is costly to eat this way, eat fresh, local, seasonal. So, well, it's actually not. If you're actually eating your local produce rather than food miles attached to it, then it's not a lot more expensive. And one of our daughters did a lot of work on this some years ago to actually work out exactly the food guideline cost versus eating this way. There's no difference. In fact, it was cheaper. What it is expensive in is in time. So it takes time to actually produce your food. But welcome to the old family scenario of people preparing food as a family, preparing it as a community, sitting down, having time over a meal, and all the social benefits of that. But I've said to patients, look, I get it. It takes time. You've got a choice, however, of spending that time cooking the food now and preparing it and spending quality time as a family, or spending that time in my waiting room and becoming a medical tourist and actually going, okay, what are we doing this week? Oh, we've got an appointment here, we've got an appointment there, we've got an appointment there. So you've got a choice to spend now on good quality food and family, or spending that time as a result of that chronic low-grade damage in doctors' offices. It's a no-brainer to me. I wish I'd known about it a lot earlier. And I'm sorry I got caught up in the propaganda.
You got into the detail of the browning of the organs when the glucose is elevated. There's also the whole aspect of that insulin resistance continuum of insulin being raised and causing its own host of problems.
So insulin is primarily, it's a hormone secreted by the pancreas. So when your blood glucose goes up, insulin gets secreted, and insulin's primary role is to actually turn that glucose into fat, move it out of the bloodstream into fat storage. It's also got two other major effects. One is as a tumor promoter. So insulin is a growth factor. It's the most potent growth factor we have for tumor progression or tumor growth. So those people who are very insulin resistant, and classic is patients with diabetes, have a much higher rate of cancer. That's just an example of it. But the mechanism is it's insulin is producing or promoting that whole metabolism of cancer, and particularly alternate metabolic pathways, a thing called the Warburg effect. Again, there's a talk of mine on cancer where I go into that insulin. The really interesting one for me was in 2020, a couple of Chinese papers showing the effect between insulin and inflammation, and particularly in relationship to osteoarthritis of the knee. So I say not everything bad came out of China in 2020. So sort of it's really interesting. So under the effect of insulin, inflammation in the knee goes up, and they reduce the insulin to the cartilage cells, and the inflammation went down. Now, I know that paper was not written by a low carber, because the conclusion at the end is, we should be targeting insulin with drug therapies in the management of arthritis and inflammation. No, I mean, that's the complete no-brainer. The thing is, if you don't eat carbohydrate, you'll reduce the insulin, and then you'll reduce the inflammation. Now, particularly in my knee patients, I've got many, many, many people over time who actually simply, with end-stage arthritis of the knee, go low carb, and within 6 to 8 weeks, their pain disappears or improves dramatically to the point of them not needing an operation. So that's the practical side. If you've got arthritis, look at inflammation first. Look at your diet. If we look inside and you talked about advanced glycation end products, AGEs, and other. There's another group of things called the metalloproteinases, which are issues related to inflammation in joints and tendons. So tendons around the shoulder, Achilles tendons. If you look at those tissues, you find the end products of glucose metabolism, advanced glycation end products. Glycation is glucose in there. You do not find the end products of protein metabolism. You do not find the end products of fat metabolism. So the primary inflammatory mechanisms that are abounding in our joints and our tendons are a result of our carbohydrate metabolism. I did try to find information related to the discs in the spine, because I thought that would be brilliant if I could. So, my cognitive dissonance is I actually tried to find it and I couldn't. But there are facet joints around the back of the spine which are going to have the same issues related to carbohydrate metabolism and arthritis. I just think, and so all of that's glucose metabolism and insulin effects. So if we're in a chronically inflamed, chronically high insulin state, and we've got a poor diet, do we medicate our way out of it, or do we lifestyle our way out of it? And there's only one sustainable option there, and that's,
I agree.
LCHF.
Just for clarity there, the Maillard reaction and the AGEs, I thought the AGEs were the browning of the tissue, the Maillard reaction. Is that different?
Yeah, they're different. So,
okay, can you clarify that?
Well, no, the Maillard reaction is a glycation of the protein. So that is just a direct chemical effect. Advanced glycation end products are byproducts of an inflammatory process, which also release oxygen-free radicals. So the AGEs are the next step down the line from that Maillard reaction. So once you actually get the Maillard reaction, that glycation, then there's some inflammation related to that. And as that breaks down, that's the advanced glycation end products. I'm trying to make that as simple as I can, I think. So the browning effect, that toasting is a primary chemical reaction. The byproducts of that are the advanced glycation end products, of which release their own inflammatory oxygen-free radicals.
Got it. Glad we clarified it, because I thought it was the same thing.
The other thing is there's stuff coming out now about it. Stuff meaning there's good research coming out about it, because this is, and again, there's no money in it for the pharmaceutical industry. There's no money in it for the food industry, but there is some science coming out, lesser known laboratories, people who are interested in it, showing a whole lot of stuff. I can't wait for another 10 years. The studies now are great, more and more studies coming about doing this intervention, not just in diabetes, but doing it in mental health, doing it in gut disorders, doing it in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I'm aware of many papers being done. I'm aware of pre-results, and using this intervention particularly in diabetes, not just type 2, but in type 1. There's a group in the world called Type 1 Grit. I'm very proud that I helped them get off the ground some years ago. I think there's 30-odd thousand of them now. Those ones that are doing low carb in type 1 diabetes are the best 0.3% controlled type 1 diabetics in the world. So diabetes, type 1, type 2, whether you consider it type 3 dementia, does not need to be a chronic progressive disease as it's continued to be promoted by the diabetes foundations of the world. It is something that if you go hard at it with a low carbohydrate intervention, those people have the ability to turn around their type 2 diabetes, put it in remission, or children or in adults potentially have normal life expectancy with type 1. And so these studies are now coming out, but they're not mainstream because that doesn't go with what we've been told and what the propagandists continue to push down our media pathways. It's a very rewarding path to travel personally. You don't have to do it all at once. Again, another daughter. It sounds like I've got hundreds of daughters. I don't actually. I got two, but she used to ring up and said, "Oh, Dad, she was at university. She said, "Oh, I've just had 4 ice creams." She had an ice cream binge. I said, "Don't worry, darling." I think I must have had 10 of those phone calls. So she fell off the bandwagon 10 times. She's now a mother of 2, and it doesn't fall off the bandwagon. So it's a bit like smoking. If you want to give up smoking, give it a crack. If you fail once, it's not the end of it. You come back and do it again. And so and if it's a transition for you, or if it's a one-off hardcore transition, doesn't matter. Any lifestyle change needs to be done with your own knowledge and with the support of those around you. And one of the problems of low carb healthy fat is actually we're surrounded by a society that is constantly trying to undermine your position on this. There's marketing at the supermarket. There's marketing at all these beautiful Whole Foods and beautiful round brown paper bags, which are actually all from the cereal industry, all to make you feel good that it's a natural product, when in fact it's going to undermine your pathway. And if you lose weight, a lot of people in the workplace are going to go and go, "Oh, you're not eating cake," and they're going to wave cake underneath your nose. Welcome to human nature. It's about undermining your success. It's tall poppy syndrome. If you are going to do this, you are taking back control of your life. You are empowering yourself. You're empowering your family. And People are jealous of that. I'm not 100% right. I'm not perfect on this, but I'm in far better. My health, I've now taken control of my health, which I didn't have control of 15 years ago. I'm still aging. I'm still ugly. I'm still going to die. I can't do anything about that, but we can all empower ourselves with that knowledge. And if we're privileged enough to be able to take on that pathway, then give it a crack. If you do it for a lifetime, that's great. If you do it for, there's been a criticism of saying, oh, it's only been shown to be beneficial for 6 or 12 months in diabetes. Yeah, so do it for 6 or 12 months and see if you can continue. The long and short of it, it can go on for years without side effects, because it's a complete dietary lifestyle change that does not require supplementation, apart from maybe the magnesium. I can't say any more. I don't know. I can keep repeating myself. I'm good at that.
Gary, I think this is a good place to end it. Really appreciate the work you're doing, this in-depth conversation. I'm going to link up your website, your social media. And again, thank you.
Jesse, thank you for the time, because we're all cogs in this big wheel.
Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Now that you're done with Gary, you're going to want to head over here and catch my chat with Prof. Noakes. He's another low-carb expert. You don't want to miss this. I'll see you over there.
So for 33 years, I promoted the carbohydrate diet, and it took me to get sick. And when I got sick and felt fat and lazy and couldn't run properly, I was ready for change.